Welcome to Valley Politics. I'm Terry Christensen. Our question for today is, why is it so hard to build affordable housing? Or is it? Matt Huerta, a longtime nonprofit leader who's now a consultant for developers of affordable housing, will help us answer these questions and better understand the challenges of building affordable housing here in the Valley. Then at the end of our show, we'll take a moment to honor and recognize the passing of Norm Mineta. And that's what's coming up on Valley Politics. Welcome everyone, and welcome Matt Huerta. Matt, tell us what you do and how you got into it.
Thanks, Terry. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. And I've been doing affordable housing and community development work for over 20 years. I went and did my undergrad at UC Davis in the late 90s, and I found my home with these wonderful student activists that were kind of taking on the world, all kinds of different social justice issues, and my heart and soul just really gravitated toward affordable housing as a way to give back and to contribute and to learn. I was just really wanting to understand, how does this process work to improve the community in a way that addresses the biggest needs of many of our communities for safe, decent, affordable housing.
Just as a former professor, what did you major in then that helped get you into this, or did a major help you?
It was actually a straight line. What's interesting is I took a class in community and regional development, so kind of the undergrad version of urban planning.
Yeah.
And my professor, Robert Weiner at the time, and he's still actually a adjunct professor there, still doing affordable housing work and leads the statewide coalition of rural housing. I took that course and really, again, found the content really enriching and helped me tap into my history. My grandfather's a bracero, and my family actually lived in affordable housing for a number of years when I was really young. So I have that deep connection and learned about that, was kind of forced to understand how that worked, and also did an internship with the California Coalition for Rural Housing, where I was placed it was a paid internship for 1 year, where I was placed at a community-based nonprofit out of Davis, but I worked on affordable housing, farm worker housing, senior housing developments in that area, and just really began to understand how the pieces fit and develop some initial relationships, and realized that was where I wanted to be.
And I know you've done some of your work in local government, some of your work as a leader of nonprofit organizations. Right now you're a consultant on affordable housing?
Yeah, so a few years ago when we first met, I think I was the executive director of Neighborhood Housing Services Silicon Valley, based here in San Jose. And that organization had been around for 20 years and had really grown up as a community development, neighborhood-oriented kind of organization to uplift neighborhood leaders and work with the city and other stakeholders to take on the biggest needs in the community, which really gravitated toward housing. And during the Great Recession, they reached out to me, and I was a developer based in Gilroy, working for another nonprofit, and they reached out, said, you know, Matt, this is a leadership opportunity. And at the time, the community was really suffering from, foreclosure crisis and the downturn, and I felt that I could play a role in being a leader in that space. And so I came here and started doing a lot more work in Silicon Valley, and have really enjoyed the relationships that I've been able to make here through that work, and just the incredible need, just the need here in the community, and the tremendous wealth that is also here, and try to figure out how to connect those dots. And I've been able to maintain those relationships through my consulting. Since that organization, we had to sunset that as the community, the needs of the community changed. And so I started my consulting practice in 2016, and basically take on, I still feel like part of what I do is kind of try to support and take on some of the biggest fights that around housing that our community faces. And right now, I have to tell you, it's homelessness.
Yeah.
And I think that's very apparent for everybody.
Everybody, yeah. So as a consultant, you contract with developers, probably usually nonprofit developers? who are proposing affordable housing projects?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I focus with nonprofit housing developers, and sometimes there's a need to make sure that when market rate developers come in to our community, right, that we make sure that there's that level of accountability and expectation around community engagement, around how they need to build relationships here, and really we want to make sure that folks are here to stay.
Yeah.
Right, and really create deep relationships long term, and I think you and I worked on one recently as well, just to name one.
Yes, I probably should have disclosed that at the outset, but I was on the community side and you were on the developer side as a consultant, but that project worked out really well. I think we'll talk about that project specifically in a few minutes, probably. So let's take a minute to define affordable housing, because most people in the Valley would just laugh when you say affordable housing, because there is no affordable housing in the Valley, or there's very little. So what does it mean when you talk about it?
Yeah, so when we talk about affordable housing in the kind of the professional class of nonprofit housing developers, we're really talking about the HUD definition, which is, nobody...
That's the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Yeah, so you're gonna have to help me break down some of these acronyms. I might throw some acronyms at you some more. Thank you for that. And so it essentially means that folks are, if they're paying over 30% of your gross income, even after accounting for utilities, then you're paying too much. So the trick is, how can we develop housing where the rents are affordable to folks living there and they're paying no more than 30% of their income? Because then that allows for more for healthcare, for education, for employment, a car maybe, whatever. And so that's the line in the sand, but it gets the other level to it too, is that it is HUD, the federal government recognizes that the marketplace is very different and incomes are very different depending if you're here in Silicon Valley or if you're in, Texas somewhere, right? So it's like we got to figure that out, and what they've done is basically utilize the median income of at the county level.
The county median income.
The county
so that's
median,
an average.
The county median income. So that's basically stringing everybody along a line and picking the middle.
Yeah.
The middle value. And they said, okay, if you're 80% or less than that, then you're considered low income. 50% of that, and you're very low income.
At the 80% level, a family could be earning $100,000 or
so here,
or more.
And again, because it's tailored to the
valley,
to the income levels, and because Silicon Valley leads the country in terms of incomes, really very extremely high incomes. Not everybody earns that much, but the median is significantly high. I think it's like for a family of four, it's over 130 grand. And so when you're taking 80% of that, you can still make pretty much six figures and be considered low income here in the Valley.
That would be a lot of professional workers, teachers, professors at the university, nurses.
Correct.
Cops, initially starting cops, not at the end of the, and so it's 80, 50.
And 30%. And basically the 30% is the ELI, the extremely low income. And so when we talk in terms of serving the different needs of the populations and workforce, right? If we're talking about homelessness and folks and very fixed income seniors, we're talking about the ELI.
The greater need is that lowest 30%.
And that's definitely the hardest to serve, and that's candidly why we haven't built enough housing, but obviously we haven't built enough housing that meets the needs of the less than 50% AMI threshold, and that's why we have this explosion of homelessness and overcrowding conditions.
And that brings us to affordable housing with supportive services. So that's been a big deal lately, especially as we try to address the challenge of homelessness and all the causes of homelessness. It's not just unemployment and not being able to pay your rent. It could be mental illness, substance abuse, other kinds of things. So tell us a little bit about what affordable housing with supportive services means.
Yeah, and I want to uplift the fact that in terms of Silicon Valley, we really have an amazing group of leaders that have come together in recent years through Destination Home, SV at Home. There's an amazing coalition of advocates that have really focused attention on the needs of addressing this population and trying to end homelessness, trying to address chronic homelessness, and have raised a lot of local funds. Measure A is a huge example where the vast majority of those funds that were passed approved by voters a few years ago, vast majority of that investment of $975 $1 million, the majority of that is dedicated to the needs of homelessness housing. And so now we're almost at the throes, maybe another year or two left of spending those resources and leveraging that with local, state, and federal resources. And so really permanent supportive housing, what we've all realized is that it's not enough just to get folks off the street and find a unit for them, whether it's a motel or a home or apartment, whatever. It has to be packaged with a case manager, with a wraparound service component that addresses the needs of really how they got there in the first place. There was some kind of gap. They didn't have access to other people, to resources. The institutions maybe have failed them. There's mental health conditions. So it's really making sure that we understand and address what are those gaps in services that created in the first place, and it can just be so many different things. And so really permanent supportive housing is understanding that everybody needs kind of a customized assistance to make sure that they get to a more stable housing situation.
And you said permanent.
And the difference, exactly. So the difference is, right, when people think of affordable housing, they might be thinking of that shelter. Right, that is just maybe a night, a weekend, a month, 3 months or 6 months, whatever, and then you're on your own again. Permanent supportive housing is like an apartment complex, but again, it's comes with the necessary case management support, and so you're not asked to move if you're not ready. The idea is to get to the next level, right? To find gainful employment, to join the ranks of folks that have upward mobility, whatever it might take, but it could take years for that to happen. And along the way, there's lots of ways for residents to heal and to, be part of the community along the way, much better than on the street or worse, and in and out of the courtroom and jail, in and out of the emergency room, which is 10 times more expensive. As much as we say that, how expensive it is to do this kind of work, it's way more cost intensive the way we've been doing it. Yeah,
absolutely. And most of the projects I've seen coming through do include supportive services.
Yeah, and that's actually, again, kudos to the Measure A and to other policies, local and state, that have said, you know what, you want our money, you have to make sure that a certain component, usually it's 25-30% of the development, you can kind of go to the front of the line if you address this population as part of your project. And sometimes you are competitive if you do 100% permanent supportive housing, but we've found that sometimes managing that intensity of a development in particular neighborhoods without maybe some immediate access to services, there may be some challenges there. So I think going forward, you're going to probably see more and more of kind of more mixed income within those thresholds that we talked about, 30, 50, 60% AMI, around that percentage. You're going to probably see a little bit more mixed in there, and also serving families. Unfortunately, what we've learned too in recent years is that the pressure of the lack of supply from housing has fallen on families as well, and the face of homelessness is very, very diverse now, including families.
Let's stick with supportive services for a minute, because you sort of alluded to one of the challenges, and that is often the community, the neighborhoods around the projects we're talking about, the affordable housing projects, are reassured by the idea that they're supportive services, but also nervous about whether they're actually going to work, because they haven't always worked. There have been problems in some of the projects. I hope they've been resolved. But how can you be sure, and what's the developer's long-term commitment to making sure supportive services actually work and some of the problems of the residents don't spill out into the neighborhoods? You've heard that concern expressed by residents near the projects you've worked on.
Absolutely. And so I think that's where we have to make sure that you have the strongest team possible when you take on these developments, these communities, that really the goal is to be part of the community. It's not like you're an alien coming in and you're an alien thing that's going to be part of the community. The whole idea is that folks are typically there already in the community, and you're trying to serve their needs to the extent possible, right? And I've learned a lot working with Reed Community Partners, coming in here with a new development in the Roosevelt Park neighborhood, And they realized that they couldn't really do the permanent supportive housing, so they teamed with abode services, and they're able to bring the case management support that's going to make that package of new community supports possible. And then in the case of my other client is People Assisting the Homeless, Path and Path Ventures out of Los Angeles. They're one of the largest permanent supportive housing providers in the state. They serve over 150 cities. And so with that kind of capacity, where you have over 1,000 folks that are every day engaged in outreach teams, going to where people are at, bringing them back into a safer place, clinicians and resident services coordinators that are providing thoughtful, interventions, whether it's employment, connection, to family members that may also be able to help. There's lots of different methods and strategies on how to deal with stabilizing an individual's housing condition. And so I'm learning a lot in terms of, a lot of my hat is finance and real estate and community, but there's really another level that's basically like healthcare oriented and clinical. And so that's the benefit of having a path here in San Jose and Silicon Valley, is that they bring a lot of that bandwidth, and now they've actually set up regional offices here in recent years. And we're actually looking at expanding those and not only addressing some of the short-term shelter needs, there's some developments there, but also again increasing the supply of permanent supportive housing.
A couple of the projects I've been involved as a community member in talking with the developers about. One's a First Community housing project, the Roosevelt Park Apartments, and First Community is going to move their offices into the building to use the commercial space. Well, that was instantly reassuring to the community, because we know that the managers of the projects are going to be on site. So I think that helped a lot. Another project, Quetzal Gardens out by the Mexican Heritage Plaza, is going to have Somos Mayfair's offices on the ground floor. And again, that was reassuring. And I think it's important for the organizations like Path and Abode and the others that provide those services to develop their own relationships with the communities around, the residents surrounding the projects. You mentioned the Path project you're working on. That's 1020 North 4th?
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that project.
Yeah, so that development had been in the process for a couple years, and essentially there was an old Dick's Market that was on site there. Many people knew it when it was there.
I did.
And then, so you probably know too that there's a historical significance to it in the fact that it was the primary grocery store as part of a large chain of Chinese-owned grocery stores here in the Valley. And so there's an amazing history there, and there's a connection to Japantown. It's located actually in Hyde Park, so there's two neighborhood associations that really kind of own it. And essentially it had been blighted and had shut down for over 10 years. And was just an eyesore and an attractive nuisance for a while. And so Path and Path Ventures looked at that site and said, you know what, it could be a prime location for permanent supportive housing. And so the quick end of the story is that some neighborhood leaders also, however, didn't think that it was the right place or the right population there for that community. And so going back to your other point, it comes back to educating folks about what this really is and what it means, the need for it, and also the kind of high quality housing that we're proposing. But it's kind of hard to just conceptualize that, right? And so fortunately, Villas on the Park by St. James offers a really good model, and we bring folks there all the time for tours. My other colleague, Laura Sandoval, who runs the regional services for Path, she has assembled an amazing team of professionals there. And so anytime anybody wants a tour, just let me know and I connect you to Laura. She's also a writer in Spotlight and brings a lot of good educational material to the community. And so we're able to lean on an actually high-functioning, very strong program there and say, look, this is a beautiful community. You can't even tell from the street that it is that it's an affordable complex because it's so beautiful. It's won tons of awards. Dahlin Architects is kind of one of our go-to architects that have designed that. And so we want to replicate that wherever we can, and 4th Street is another example of where we were able to do that. The one last thing I'll say about 4th Street is that it's under construction now. We secured permits, we got Measure A funding. We were able to secure 9% tax credits, which in that vein of it, it's just know that it's a incredibly competitive funding source, right? That leverages tax credits that brings in private equity. So it's a public-private partnership, really, that makes this happen. And we were able to compete for that because we got our entitlements, right, the permission to move forward and build what we were proposing, because of state legislation that allowed us to move forward because we met the objective standards, basically the standards that were already codified in the zoning and the general plan amendment. And so state law says, you know what, if you meet all these requirements, including a permanent supportive housing piece, then you go to the front of the line, and there's very specific requirements that the city needs to meet. And basically, it kind of almost inoculates you from a legal challenge around CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, where there's lots of different, some legit, others not so legit reasons why you can, kind of attack a project, right? And so those kind of state legislation, and this was actually the first, it was called AB 2162, but the first streamlining project to use that state resource is the first one in San Jose, and there's many more planned.
Well, that's good progress. Let's get to the bottom line here, which is, why is it so hard to build affordable housing? Is it money? Is it community resistance? Is it the long permit process? What's going on?
Yeah, I think it starts with political will and ends with political will. Because I think, if I know as a developer that I have support from a council member or a supervisor, mayor, then as issues come up, and if I and the team are being reasonable and responsive and thoughtful and careful about how we respond and build relationships with the community, then we should be able to maintain that support. And so sometimes that breaks down, but that political will is super important, because if you don't have that, then no matter what I do, if folks bring up issues that are legit or not, and they have the ear of somebody who is powerful in a decision-making capacity, they can really, slow down or maybe even kill a project. So political will is super important at the front end of a development project to help, things, the planning process and community engagement process, and then actually when it comes to actually getting permit approval and or funding. So I think political will for a long time hadn't been there. And then, in recent years, it's been improved. We have a mayor who has leaned forward in that here in San Jose and many other communities here in the Valley. There's at least voicing support for affordable housing. Now, when you get a site and then you get a neighborhoods actually engaged around that, things can kind of get more interesting. But generally, there's a lot of political will for more housing and more deeply affordable. So
NIMBYism, not in my backyard, that's still there.
I think that's still pretty much the number one concern, because the other items we have to continue. There's not enough money for sure, and when you do have some funds, it's not enough, but we're working with what we have, right? And San Jose is a good example again of where Measure E passed by voters a couple years ago to add another $30–40 million of annual, new bucket of resources, commercial linkage fees. There's other in lieu fees that are paid by developers that are doing market rate housing that they pay into as well. So there's different ways of that San Jose and other communities have been able to pull subsidy together to then leverage state money and federal dollars. But again, it's just not enough because the need is so great, right? The last thing I'll say about that is when you look at the next 10 years, because we're going into this new regional housing needs assessment cycle, right, with the state and how to plan out for what do the next 8 to 10 years look like. The Bay Area is required basically to plan and or build over 440,000 new homes to meet the needs that we know now, right? Even as people are shifting and moving, we know that that's the need. And out of that big number, around 180,000 are at that lower threshold, right? The low and very low income thresholds that we know needs subsidy in order to keep those rents lower. And so we know that we need to continuously figure out new funding streams and permanent funding streams, not only locally, but also at the state and federal level.
Well, talking about funding, the number that's being kicked around by some candidates for office now, some public office holders, is $850,000 a unit. Is that a reasonable average to think about?
You know, it's candidly a concern of myself and other developers as well. Some of it's, you know, how it gets done now. It's part of why we know the system's broken. When you have to have, the fact that you have to have 5 to 10 different funding sources.
Yeah.
Well, each funding source has their own timeline, their own legal documents, you know, their own personalities. Yeah. And so the complexities involved add time and money. And so that's a big chunk of it. The other big chunk of it here that's particular to the Valley is the high land cost.
Yeah.
And so what we've been looking at, and I think a lot of jurisdictions here and also the other public entities such as the Valley Transit Authority they've activated several parking lots and other transit-oriented developments, right, that they own. So we need to continue leveraging the publicly owned lands and make sure we exhaust all those opportunities as we also activate other private opportunities and infill opportunities. There's just a lot of work to do.
Construction costs are up too.
And then there's the supply chain is real. We're seeing anywhere from 20 to 60% increases.
But that's it. I built an ADU, an accessory dwelling unit, in my backyard for $250,000. The land was free.
There you go.
It's 500 square foot. And anyway, we're almost out of time. Just tell us briefly what you think best practices are for getting affordable housing built.
Yeah, so I think that it comes down to really pulling together the strongest possible team, like I was saying. Not only the finance, design, and construction team that will get it done, but really developers need to see the community as part of that team. They need to ensure that the local elected officials are part of that team, and that there's transparency as much as possible at the front, during, and even after a development. Because again, the whole idea is that these affordable housing communities, whether it's permanent supportive housing or seniors or families, need to be integrated into the community. And so the more that we can strengthen that full team, the better we can all move forward together.
Yeah, I would just say, and along with all those, and finding the money, it's early buy-in by the community. The Algarve project that you consulted on for Scott Reed, that was early consulting. They listened, they adapted the project, they changed the name of the project.
That's right.
Having heard the community, and having that early community buy-in is really important, but hard to get.
It's hard to get. Well, we need people like you and other neighborhood leaders that understand it and that are willing to kind of stand up and say, yes, in my backyard, right, and lean forward into that.
With that, Matt, we're out of time. Thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
We'll be back next month with the first in our series of conversations with runoff candidates in local elections. Meanwhile, you can follow us on Facebook, and you can catch up on all our previous shows on our website at createtvsj.org or on YouTube by searching for CreateTV San Jose. Now, before we go, we must sadly note the passing of Norm Mineta. Norm was mayor of San Jose from 1971 to 1975, a turning point in city politics. He went on to serve 10 terms in Congress and as Secretary of Commerce under President Clinton and Secretary of Transportation under President Bush. We'd like to take a moment to remember Norm with a short excerpt from our 2015 interview with him. You can see the full interview by going to Valley Politics History Interviews on YouTube. But for now, here's Norm.
Well, I think the biggest thing was when those signs went up about our evacuation and internment, and it said, "Attention, all those of Japanese ancestry, alien and non-alien." And even as a 10-year-old kid, as I looked at those posters, I thought, what's a non-alien? So, it's a citizen, but here my own government wasn't willing to acknowledge me as a citizen. Mm-hmm. I'm a non-alien. But when's the last time you stood up, beat your chest, and said, I'm a proud non-alien of the United States of America? And that's why I cherish the word citizen, because my own government wasn't willing to acknowledge me as a citizen, and to this day I still cherish the word citizen, even though the greater impact was on adults. But even as a 10-year-old, that was the one thing that I just remember from the evacuation and internment experience.